room at BLOXHUB. Welcome to Copenhagen. Welcome you behind the screens. I hope there's a lot of people out there who's going to join this session about dilemmas, challenges within cities combined with COVID-19, Corona. How do we cope with this when we do the city planning, when we do the urban strategies? How do we cope with this as an individual in cities when we have to walk around and wear a mask all the time? It is complicated, right? Sometimes I've been having these classes and it was a mix it didn't work very well. I couldn't really see what I was doing when I worked around. So no mask in here, but that's just a small detail. Within the next 15 minutes, we're gonna have a good and fruitful debate with this very competent panel we got here. We have City Chief Architect Camilla van Deurs from Copenhagen, City of Copenhagen. Simon Hansen from Director of Regions in C40 cities. And not at least, Niels Lund. You are working with cities changing diabetes, and you have another title, Promoting Health and...
Prevention and health promotion.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So, with these different competences and approaches to cities and city development in these special times where we do have Corona, COVID-19 and so on, we will try to have a fruitful and hopefully energetic debate about what to do and what not to do. How do we have our cities now and within next year, 5 years, 10 years and so on? I know that you have different ideas what to do, and it can be on strategy level, but also on individual level, which is important because we should know what to do as an individual living in cities as well. But first, you all got like 5 minutes to introduce what is part of your job, what are you doing regarding working with these issues. And I know, Camilla, you and the people in the city administration of Copenhagen have been busy. Please explain a little about what you have been doing the last 3 months or more.
Well, I think like everyone in the world, we've been caught a little bit off guard. And this is the way we've had to react is completely contrary to the way we usually think about cities, which is about, inviting people in, engaging for sociability, inviting for community. So many of the natural features of how we try to program our cities, we'd have to rethink. And for us, until now, it's been about 4 different phases of this development. And unfortunately, there are probably going to be very many more iterations of how we have to act. But initially for us as a city, the first lockdown, where everything completely came to a halt, of course, was a challenge in terms of how do we navigate in this. And in the early days, it was a lot of governmental advice from the police, from the national government that we had to very quickly respond to. So that meant a lot of flexibility for my colleagues throughout the different administrations, from the schools, kindergartens to parking attendants suddenly having to go into public space and police the way we walked. So in Copenhagen, one of the first measures was to one-way the walking direction around the lakes. So my colleagues had to go out and control that, which was something new for them. And in the second phase, as we became a little bit more accustomed to this closure and keeping social distance, trying to create spaces that were safe, where, tape measures we've seen all across the world sort of trying to indicate social distances became something that we had to relate to very quickly. But as government advice was changing all the time, that had to be very flexible. So it was difficult for us to, build something. We talked about it initially as like Dogville urbanism, where we drew up signs like maybe some of you know the Lars von Trier movie. And we really had to sort of try to reinvent a positive way of speaking about this. How do we invite for sociable spaces even though we're locked down? What does that mean in terms of schools? What does that mean in terms of our nursing homes? And then in the third phase, Copenhagen started to open up quite quickly compared to other countries in the world that are just in that phase now. And what we saw was like a desperate need for people to go out into public space, particularly our young demographic, And that created some issues in our city with overcrowding public spaces. So the very popular spaces along the harborfront, for instance, people desperate to come out. They couldn't still be in the restaurants, really, so they were in public space. They were spending time hanging out, using the water. And due to that, we had to sort of enforce noise guards, which is something that we don't really use. In Copenhagen, we entered a collaboration with the Roskilde Festival and some of their trained guards. So in a lot of aspects, we really had to kind of rethink how we were addressing this. And now that we're maybe coming into a fourth phase in Copenhagen, where unfortunately the disease numbers are rising again, we've had to close down a little bit more, close more public spaces, and start to work with that.
I mean, a lot of interesting things here, right? Because now you're talking the fourth phase. You plan to open even more up, and suddenly we have more cases and so on. Are you then going back to phase one, or what is going on there?
I think we've learned a lot from the first phases. So now we have a system in place, and everyone is much more aware. Shop owners know how to handle this. We have now opportunities for outdoor serving in parking spaces. Our schools are, better equipped at having multiple entrances, which is important so you don't have too many mixings. In our nursing homes, we have new tents that are outside so people can still meet their relatives in a safe environment. So I think we're better geared. And what we're seeing now is the discussion of how does this impact our future planning? So what does that mean in terms of providing more public space, greener public space, which has really been a big desire throughout this COVID period.
And we'll get back to that, because the greener spaces, this is, it's very important for all of you. I mean, before we move on, Camilla, this dog wheel setup thing, please explain, because it's combined with the young people at the harbor side and so on. I mean, it's some white squares.
So
right?
basically, it's masking up the area of social distance. So masking up an area where you can be together with the people that you arrive with, and anywhere from 2 to 10 people, depending on the government official recommendations at that time. But of course, it creates suddenly spaces within space, in public space. So it's a different sort of way of moving, and we have to control how people are behaving, which is something quite
did it work?
unnatural.
Did it work?
Unfortunately, no. Not every place.
No?
And I think that's because we've had such beautiful weather, and people have been desperate to come outside and do all the events and do the family vacations, holidays, birthday parties that they're not able to do inside.
Yeah. Well, I can't remember von Trier dog wheel whether it worked there, but I mean that's another story. Simon, I mean you've been doing city development and working with cities all over the world for quite a while. We had an interesting talk some days ago. What is going on within your work, in your scope, within cities in the Nordic region, but also on the global scale regarding COVID-19 and so forth?
Well, C40, the organization I work for, we are a group of now 96 cities in all parts of the world. We focus on mega cities. And what's interesting is that most of your colleagues, Camilla, in the different C40 cities, whether it's in Africa, the US, or Latin America, or Southeast Asia, or here in Europe, they would recognize many of the challenges you just described, because COVID-19 is, as we all know, a global pandemic. And it affects cities all over the world. And what we've seen in C40, and that's a positive thing, is that because it's a global pandemic, because cities share many of the same challenges and experiences trying to tackle this terrible health crisis, they can really learn a lot from each other. They can really exchange ideas about what to do. And therefore the mayors in C40 have had lots of meetings, virtual of course, where they've explained to each other, what happens in my city, what am I doing to tackle this? So we've really seen a fantastic global city collaboration faced with this common threat of COVID-19. But we are also seeing a very significant challenge. And it has to do with something very fundamental about cities, which is that urban density itself is now being looked at as a problem for many people. And there is a North American urbanist, Joel Kotkin, who has sort of predicted that we will now move into an age of dispersion. So what we've seen in the past couple of decades, that there has been this drive towards the city centers, and they have really seen a renaissance. They have, in many ways, flourished. He is now predicting that we will see an opposite trend. People will move out of the dense city centers. And I'm afraid he considers that something that's positive. But what we can see in C40 is that urban density is one of the best tools we have to tackle the climate crisis, which of course is the other global crisis we cannot forget, because we are very focused on COVID-19.
Because what you explained, and I talked to Niels as well, and so on. I mean, right now, like two tracks, right? More density, less density. Living apart, do your own vegetables and so on, or do the compact city. Is that hard issue in C40 cities as well?
Yes, we see this challenge in a number of ways. First of all, many cities have invested in mass transit solutions. And that's often a carbon emissions neutral way of bringing lots of people around in a city, and often also one of the less expensive ways of moving around in a city. But if we take a city like Bogota, which have a very sort of expansive bus rapid transit system, lots of people use that. They really suffer now because less people are getting on the bus because of COVID-19. If we take a city like London, we can see that in the outer parts of London, there is a quite significant increase in car congestion because more people choose their car over all the other great options you actually have in London for trains or buses. So cities are suffering in that way. And I think the reason it's a very problematic thing is not only because it affects, for example, mass transit opportunities and erodes some of the economic basis for that. It's also a problem because we can see that dense cities, they have less emissions than more dispersed urban areas.
Okay.
And Copenhagen is a great example. In Copenhagen, there is per capita 2.5 tons of CO2 emissions per year. In Denmark as a whole, it's more than double. And if you look at the
So what's your point there, Simon? What's your point?
Well, the point is that I think we should take it very seriously that due to COVID-19, due to this health crisis, there is this move away from urban density. And we have to counter that because there is no evidence that urban density, that the very dense cities that find it more difficult to tackle COVID-19. And again, I think Copenhagen is a great example. If that was the case, the Copenhagen municipality would be the area in Denmark which has the most COVID-19 affected people compared with the number of inhabitants. But that has never been the case. I don't even think Copenhagen is in top 10. So we have to move away from this myth that the urban cities can be a problem when it comes to COVID-19, so that we can keep some of the strengths of dense urban cities.
I mean, now this is getting interesting, and we will get back to this discussion about.
Well, I'm happy that finally it's getting interesting.
Please save your question, and then we move on to you, Niels. You are here. You are working with health, but also in a very broad sense, because you are working together with C40 cities and many other organizations around the world. Please explain, where are you now? I mean, you've been working with city change diabetes for
6 years.
Yeah, quite a while, and you are all over the world. What's going on?
We are all over the world. Actually, to Simon's point, I don't think it's anything to do with density. It has to do with vulnerability and inequality. That's the issue, and that's the issue that we need to tackle. And let me take us up a little bit into the helicopter and then land in Houston with a specific example. Because just taking off. If you look at the combination of diabetes, obesity, and COVID, it is a really, really bad cocktail. There's a 2 to 3 times higher risk of dying from COVID-19 if you have one of those underlying conditions, irrespective of age. So there's something going on here, and what is that? Traditionally, if you're a health geek, there's been a dichotomy between infectious disease and chronic disease. You treat the one in one track and the other one in another track. I think that's a false dichotomy. And I think when we look at who is disproportionately affected by COVID-19, diabetes, climate events, it's the poor. It's the ones who are at the low end of the social spectrum. So unless we understand social determinants, cultural determinants of health, and the underlying factors that drive inequality within our cities and more generally, then I don't think we will have a response to this health crisis or any other health crisis that moves forward. Diabetes is interesting in a city context because it's a flip side of a good story, because more than half of the world's population live in cities now, but already now 2/3 of the people with diabetes live in cities now. And that's a byproduct of prosperity. It's our urban lifestyle. We drive our cars. We sedentary lifestyle. We expand around the midpoint here.
Yeah, I know myself.
Yes.
Yeah.
So and for some that leads to chronic disease, but it also hits disproportionately. In Houston, and now we land the helicopter.
Now we're landing.
Yes. Yeah. Is one of the 27 cities that we're working very closely with, and we did a anthropological study in addition to a lot of the biomedical and all of the hard data, and then we looked at what drives vulnerability, what drives risk of diabetes, and in addition to age, sometimes ethnicity, some of these classical factors, we found 2 factors: mistrust in public institutions and isolation. Those are also risk
isolation on individual plan?
I mean, the people that you feel isolated, that you don't feel part of a community, and also mistrust is a factor that that you don't. If the local community health center is not a place where you feel that represents something that you don't like, you basically mistrust them because you have never felt them caring for you in the first place. Then what do you do? I mean, then you don't go there.
No.
So then where do you go then? And it is an example from Houston. Houston is a place in the U.S. If you know, it's a big urban sprawl, but
Not really compact at all.
well, the center is very compact, but then there's a really big urban sprawl. But faith-based organizations are really strong. Churches, mosques, and so on are really strong community centers there. And what's interesting, and here I'm speaking as the agnostic Dane. What I think is interesting is that faith organizations or faith-based places are places where people come because they trust each other, and they also break their isolation there. So what this, with the University of Texas and others, we put together a program called Faith and Diabetes, where we train the trainers, talk about how can faith and diabetes, what are the barriers, what are the opportunities, can we also provide diet advice, and then we use the churches. The communities, and churches here are just examples of building stronger communities. When formal health systems fail, then what do we do? What do we turn to? And so this was an example of a case in diabetes, but the same network of faith-based organizations now also help to address COVID-19 because they already know each other. So it becomes a resilience factor.
Wow. I mean, now we are around here, right? And we are on different levels already. I mean, you are talking trust, faith between individual people. Simon, you are at the high city level, what to do, compact cities or not. So, I mean, the scope here is pretty wide right now. Before we dive in with some more, I have some questions here. If you've got any questions, I'll get back to you in like 10 minutes. So please, if you have any, let me know in like 10 minutes. Okay, here we are. Compact cities. The opposite of compact cities, living apart, far from each other. Getting this hint of xenophobia, I don't know, maybe it's a bit too harsh. Then we have trust and faith and being part of something. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, if you trust someone, you are more relaxed and you talk with people and so on. If the opposite is the situation, maybe you do like this and you don't feel safe and so on. And then we have you. You're the one operating on a daily basis to make this very nice city working.
But a city with problems. I mean, chronic diabetes is one of the growing fastest lifestyle disease in Copenhagen, and we have a 6-year difference in life expectancy between the different boroughs. So, health issues are very much at the center of urban planning. I completely agree with Simon, where it's more about rich health or rich density versus poor density. in terms of our lifestyle. Can we work from home? Do we have the luxury, the affordability to order our stuff online? Like all of these new ways of working and living completely influence the COVID disease right now. But some of these tendencies go against what we know is a healthy, active lifestyle in terms of preventing diabetes. So there's also that dilemma. You know, we want to get outside, we want to move and engage, which is the opposite of what we're trying to do.
So how do you work with this in the city of Copenhagen? Creating space and incentives to walk around, to run around, and so on.
Yeah, I mean,
when we have this shadow of COVID-19.
One thing we're increasingly talking about is this concept of the 15-minute neighborhood. And that's been moving for quite some years in Copenhagen, with the North Harbor as the first new urban development being planned according to these principles, which is really about being able to walk and cycle in your own neighborhood and reach all the activities that you need in your daily life. So you have your school, you have your cultural institutions, shopping, everything you need you can do by walking or bicycling. And that's been, I think, a real strength for us, because we have, as you also said, seen dramatic downfalls in our public transit numbers, about 30%, whereas bicycling is up by 120%. So that, at least for Copenhagen, has been a very safe way of people still being able to engage and to move around. And by focusing on this, I think we saw at least quite strong local neighborhoods and communities sort of come through in this crisis. People were reaching out to each other, helping each other. I mean, inspired by beautiful videos from Italy. People were singing in the balconies, you know, some of these romantic things that Danes never do. They're very introvert. So I think if we can even talk about a benefit of this crisis, is that the sense of community and how civil society comes into play is becoming, more apparent, and we're starting to discuss that in our city.
Okay, thank you. Well, let's stay here about communities and so on, Niels, and then we move to cities level.
Because I think an interesting example, so around here where we are, in the center of Copenhagen, diabetes prevalence is roughly 2.5 percentage points. 2.5% of the population here. If you go to Tingbjerg, it's 7.5, which underlines your point about the 6-year difference.
Yeah, and it's like 6 kilometers or something from here, right?
Something, I mean, actually a fairly short bike ride. And I think what is, one of the things that is positive there is the project that the Steno Diabetes Center is doing together with the municipality of Copenhagen, called Tingbjerg Changing Diabetes, which is where they map all the different actors, the cricket club, the library, the supermarket, the scouts group, if there is one, I mean, and see how all of them can contribute to strengthen the community sense, but also live, how can each of them support the others in living a healthy lifestyle, an active lifestyle. Maybe also talk with the supermarket about where they place their goods, so it's not as tempting to have all the candy at the end. So you work in what they call a super setting, so understanding the setting where you are not just as in the individual in your household, but in the whole community. And I think that holds we'll see where it goes, but it really holds a strong promise for finding solutions that also can address some of those challenges in areas that are not as, you can say, affluent as Nordhavn. And I think it just needs to be a balance, and we need to do things in different places.
And I think for us, we're really seeing both the schools be a very active part in our neighborhoods, but also the sports facilities. That's the big public investment as well that drives some of this sense of community based on the Danish, thought of the cooperative movement, which is active as well within the sports world.
I mean, regarding the communities and lack of communities where you feel comfortable and you ask something in your hood and so on. I mean, you work with cities all over the world. Is there a difference compared from, let's say, the Nordic Scandinavian region to Asia, or you mentioned Houston and so on? I mean, what's the difference? Maybe here in the Nordic we are doing like this, right?
I think that, there are differences, and I don't have the complete taxonomy of society. I'm not a social scientist in that regard. But I observe, at least with the 27 cities that we have, 6 of them are in China, that there are 3 broad categories. There's a very top-down, the Chinese way, which is guidance, and where civil society is very weak. But you can see some trickles there where we can work with community health centers and otherwise.
Yeah.
Then there's the welfare state, and there is something strange going on, because sometimes we rely on the welfare state to take care of us, where we will see in the U.S. Or North America, where health systems are very fragmented, if not dysfunctional, then you need to have a fallback. And that's where community groups, take on responsibility that you, for example, don't see civil society organizations do in our case. Yeah. So again, for example, the churches also working in the field of health. You won't see that in Denmark, for example.
No.
So I think that decentralized, centralized, and then there's something in the middle of the sandwich, which is the welfare state that sometimes does one thing and then sometimes does the other.
Yeah, and we could discuss for hours about the welfare state and plus and minus and pros and cons and so on. But I mean, we have to move on here now. Let's try to move from this level of local communities and so on to you, Simon. What about cities on the urban strategy level, and the how to develop the cities? What to do on the large scale, on the big scale of cities around the world?
Well, I mean, in my first in my first 5 minutes here, I was very focused on some of the challenges that we see in cities due to COVID-19. But I think we also see a tremendous urban innovation happening currently in cities all over the world due to this very weird experience of lockdown. Many cities have experienced the same thing as in Copenhagen, that citizens took their bicycles if they had them, or they walked to places where maybe previously they would have found another way to get there. A city like Milan, therefore, has in a very limited time scale, because there were way less cars on the street, they took parts of their roads and made them designated bicycle lanes, and they did that in just 3 weeks' time. And that's something that the people who live in Milan have really felt was a fantastic opportunity. And they could, the clear blue skies and this feeling of, the air quality being way improved. So cities like Milan and in many other places of the world, they're now saying, how can we make that a permanent thing? Exactly. Yeah. That it's easier to walk, it's easier to bicycle, we have better air quality. We also see, coming back to the really good points about the social impacts of COVID-19, and I agree 100%, I think this is the key factor we should look at. You see a city like Lisbon, which has a huge part of its housing that's for short-term rental for tourists. But no tourists are coming now, so Lisbon has offered certain incentives to those who own those buildings, so that instead they can make this affordable, cheap housing for people who really need it. And the incentives works that they get some assurance for a more long-term income, but they are also bringing this out of the short-term rental market that has been quite a challenge in many of the cities that gets the most tourists. So that's another example of innovation that we find in cities. In a city like Seoul, where buildings is more than 60% of their entire CO2 emissions, they're saying rightly so, we need to do something about our buildings to make them more energy efficient. We also need to create jobs. So they're starting with their publicly owned buildings and saying, okay, we won't accept that they're not top-notch when it comes to energy efficiency. That will create lots of jobs, and it will also create a market where we are quite certain that then the private homeowners, they will follow. So I think we see, again, in all parts of the world, in many different areas, that this is also leading to innovation, and that's really the silver lining of this terrible health crisis that we're in.
Yeah, and I mean, when you're having discussions with colleagues and mayors and so on, I mean, is this just some temporary thing, this COVID-19, or cities do the planning for permanent scale, or what to say here? I mean, because some people, myself, I mean, I hope this will. I mean, in 6 months we are back to normal. But what is normal, and what is the new normal?
But that's where I think it's very positive that mayors are saying, the impacts of what we've been doing as part of lockdown, for instance, the things we've learned, we need to make those learnings permanent, not just temporary. So a city like Freetown in Sierra Leone, they've realized that it's difficult to ask citizens to wash their hands when there's no access to water. So one of the things they're really looking at and getting lots of support from development banks and others who can help make those investments is making sure there is way more access to water in the informal settlements.
Yeah.
And the goal of Mayor Akisoya in Freetown is that at least 20% of the inhabitants in informal settlements should now get access to water. That's a permanent improvement. And we see the same pattern in many cities all over the world. And I think that's the key thing. There are good and bad things we've learned because of COVID-19. Let's make sure that we act on those learnings and do it in a permanent way.
Thank you. Camilla, regarding permanent, not permanent planning and strategy and so on, what's going on in Copenhagen?
I think we've at least learned two things. One is in terms of our CO2 emissions. We had a 16% drop during the first hard lockdown. 16%. Which is quite substantial. So during lockdown, the politicians voted to try to make our city center car-free. So we'll be working with that the next 2 years to experiment with reducing mobility and congestion, which of course has an air quality impact as well. And the other thing has really been this access to green space and talking about biodiversity in a new way in the city. So 7 new parks, a political target of maximum 300 meters from your front door to a green urban space, really sort of drastically trying to put some measures and some numbers to increasing better access to green space.
Yeah. Okay, so more green
and
space.
that will have the same long-term effect, obviously, that you're discussing.
Yeah. I mean, some more green spaces, parks and so on. And again, are you going to draw the dogwheel things in the parks, or do you expect that all of us, the population, we know how to act and behave, or what?
I think we definitely see people acting differently in space. I mean, there's the social bubble, which is new to us. And as designers, I think we're thinking that spaces have to be flexible and they have to in some way be able to be dividable. And we see that in terms of our public institutions that, like you're discussing with wash basins for washing hands, something as simple as having many doors in a building becomes important again, that you can separate different functions and you can enter a function in different ways. So it's a return to some of these like very classical architectural values that we've long talked about as great city building.
Okay. Now it's your turn. If you got any questions, please let us know. Any questions so far? Regarding what we've been through? That's not the case. Then I'll bring one.
There was one.
Yeah, please, and please introduce yourself. There's a mic there. Sorry. Yeah. You have to reach half of the world.
We can hear you, but
my name is Søren Manikas, working for a company called Nandesmatech. So this event, overall is Nordic Edge. This is very much about smart cities. It's very much about IoT. So I haven't yet heard. Well, you mentioned a little bit, Simon, but I haven't really heard yet. Very solid examples, specifically from you, Camilla, and from you, Niels, in regards to how you use digital platforms and how you use IoT to benefit from this situation. You could, if you wanted to implement the bicycle situation that Simon explained, you could put trackers on all bicycles in Copenhagen and incentivize people using, going more than 10 kilometers in their bikes, or you could put it on cars and incentivize the people that leave their cars at home. Anything like that. Have you some examples or some considerations in regards to the digital IoT part of a more healthy vision?
Yeah.
So we've been doing some tracking with the help of Gail, Jeff Reesum is here, during COVID to see how our citizens responding and using digital measures like trackers and like pedestrian and bicycle measuring to understand how public space and how people are responding to this crisis. Of course, we use our public platforms, our social media as well, and that's been a way for us as a city to try to turn this narrative around from the enforcement and the government official, the police communication, which has been a very strong part of this, and to see how, as a city, can we start to motivate people in a different way. And one of the things we've been doing is trying to use digital media to tell about new public spaces and trying to disperse people more. So inviting them to go to green spaces in different city areas that they haven't experienced before as a way to get them away from these overly used, very popular spaces.
Yeah, Niels, please.
Not systematically, but a couple of examples. In China, which was one of the first countries to experience this virus, our colleagues and in collaboration with the cities developed an online platform for people with diabetes to know where there were stocks of insulin. I mean, this is something very basic and that that they don't have typically. You'll get a prescription, you go to the pharmacy, and then you pick up your medicine. But if you are limited to your neighborhood, then where can I go? And we created a platform that actually enabled people to know where the medicine was. Is that IoT? No, it's probably not. But it's probably a way of using technology to find solutions that probably be permanent. And our US colleagues have worked quite considerably with combining anthropological data, knowledge about vulnerability, and mapping that over census data to know where the communities are that are most at risk. And that also will enable city leaders and city planners to say, okay, this is probably where we should have a particular attention to it. So it's more big data analysis than it is IoT. As close as I can get, but those are two examples of where we're trying to do that.
Would you like to add something there, or?
Well, maybe just I gave an example about buildings previously, and one of the really interesting collaborations we've seen in C40 is actually between Copenhagen and Beijing, because one of the things Copenhagen is doing really well is the buildings you own as a city have using data to track real time if there are any anomalies, something that doesn't look right in electricity usage in those buildings, because that's a quick way to detect if there's something you need to fix.
Or if people are at work, which they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be home. So we can also see that if they're at
maybe
work.
that as well. But the thing is, that's really a very practical tool to make sure you keep your energy consumption down. And that's something that now in Beijing, they're very interested in setting up a similar system. And another example of how good ideas and smart solutions, they tend to travel very quickly.
Yeah. If we have platforms for sharing and so on. Any further questions? It's okay. We have like 4 minutes, 3.5. Compact cities or 15-minute cities where we have everything within reach of 15 minutes. Work, daycare, food, whatever. I know it's on your agenda. What's going on in Copenhagen on this issue, this level? And what about you at Novo Nordisk? What is going on when we're talking compact cities, or maybe the opposite? Let's start with you, Niels. You've got like 1 minute.
In Novo Nordisk and compact cities, it's not our area specialty, but in this program, I think it throws a positive hand grenade into city planning by putting the individual at the center of everything that you think about. And I think that is, that shift is really, really positive, because I think by focusing on the individual and the opportunities and the challenges that are in the neighborhood, then I think we actually will get to, nicer, better cities with high well-being.
And what you're saying there, it is, I sense that, it's needed, right? With this hand grenade or some.
I think so. It's with working with municipality, and I won't mention any specific. The challenge is that everything is organized in silos, and there are some that are worse examples, and there are some better examples. But they are all is health Is it the technical part, the parks and so on? They're all distributed in silos. And there's, if you just try to explore that cross-functional collaboration, it is really, really difficult. And sometimes it's screwed up by the political system also. Yeah. But it's But if we decide then to put the needs of the individual and the family and the community at the center, then that's a completely different look at how you organize the city and also how you govern the city.
Thank you, Niels. Regarding cities and silos and so on, Camilla, this one is
oh my God.
This is part of you and your
I didn't
work,
mention
right?
Copenhagen.
Yeah, no, I did. Any comments regarding the compact city and what to do and what not to do?
I think one of the things that we're seeing is that people are living and working in different ways during this crisis, and offices are scaling down, so floor spaces are diminishing, and we really see a need for combatant of loneliness as well. People are living increasingly alone, and so during a crisis like this, how do you work in your local neighborhood? Can you meet with someone? And there might be some changing patterns, for instance, in our shopping patterns, where many stores are sort of left unused, and what's happening on our main streets, providing new opportunities and new space functions in our local neighborhoods that we hadn't considered before. They could maybe become some of these community hubs or working spaces. So I think we're going to see a change in those kind of user patterns related to this crisis.
But also, I mean, getting to you in a minute, Simon.
That's fine.
I mean, the compact thing, I mean, where is Copenhagen? Is it feasible for Copenhagen to be a 15-minute city? I mean,
you can bike almost anywhere in Copenhagen in 15.
Yeah.
You can cross like a third of the city. So yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
And we've had this long tradition. Now, Simon mentioned a lot of other cities starting to build bicycle infrastructure. Copenhagen has done that over 50 years, so we were geared for this, not with this in mind. But I think for us, it's really demonstrated the power of making those strong public investments, because that creates the flexibility of use.
Okay, thank you. You got like 35 seconds.
Okay. That's fine.
Yeah.
Now, what I think is interesting here is that COVID-19 has given us new reasons for loving the compact city, which I think you've all seen I do. So it's not just because it diminishes the reliance on the car, because you can have collective energy solutions, because we tend to live smaller and therefore use less resource in compact cities. It's not just that. It's actually also more resilient when crisis hits. Because it's extremely practical that you have your basic needs within 15 minutes of walking or cycling distance if a crisis hits. And I think that's something we have to remember. The city is super resilient, and COVID-19 has taught us that as well. So another reason for loving the compact city.
Thank you. Let's give the panel a hand. Thank you for coming.